You new here?
First week.
Then you don't know about Carol.
Should I?
Depends.
On what?
Whether you think quiet people are harmless. The woman carrying the folder?
Yep.
She barely talks.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And
we're
it's
disappointed about hearing you.
So what's the big deal? Do you know why Martin hates questions? No.
Because questions leave records. Is what
Controlist. I don't get it.
Doesn't matter.
That's fair.
You will. Good of you to finally join us, Carol.
When did you change the Henderson report numbers?
This happened in a mid-size insurance firm in Cincinnati, 2009. The kind of office where hierarchy was felt before it was seen, where certain people occupied certain rooms and everyone else understood without being told, where they were allowed to stand. Carol Simmons had worked there for 7 years. Quietly, competently, without particular drama. Most people, if asked to describe her, would have used the word nice, which is what people say when they have not been paying attention. Martin Reeves had been paying even less than most. That was his first mistake. It was not his last. Martin had decided who Carol was somewhere around her 3rd week in the building. He hadn't made a formal judgment about it, nothing conscious. It happened the way most judgments happen, quietly in the background, while something else had his attention. She had smiled when introduced, answered questions without elaborating, kept her desk orderly, thanked people when they held the elevator. Pleasant, reliable, not someone you needed to think about too carefully. And so he didn't. That's usually how it works. People form a picture of someone from 3 or 4 early moments and then treat that picture as complete. They stop collecting information because they believe they already have enough. Martin had stopped collecting information about Carol somewhere around week 3. By the time this story takes place, that was 7 years ago. 7 years of details he had looked at without seeing. He had never noticed, for instance, the way she listened in meetings, not the surface of it, the nodding, the occasional note, but the quality underneath. Carol did not listen to respond. She listened to retain, numbers, phrasing, the small moments where someone told a story slightly differently than they had told it the week before. She caught all of it, filed it somewhere, never mentioned it. He had never noticed the notebook. Small, dark blue cover, unremarkable in the way that useful things often are. She kept it in her bag, not on her desk. She never wrote in it during meetings. She wrote in it after, alone, usually early morning, before the building filled with people and noise and the performance of productivity. Which brought him to the other thing he had missed. Carol arrived early, not to be seen arriving early, not to signal dedication or ambition. She arrived early because the early morning was the only time the shared drive moved without interruption, when the system was quiet and the previous day's changes were still visible if you knew where to look. Most people don't notice this, but the people who are truly paying attention rarely look like they are paying attention. Carol had never looked like anything in particular. Steady, modest, easy to overlook. It would take 7 years and 1 meeting for Martin to understand that this had never been accidental. And by then, of course, it was far too late to matter. The Tuesday meetings started at 9 and were supposed to end at 10. They rarely did. Martin had a way of filling whatever time was available, not with extra content, but with extra certainty. He moved through agenda points the way someone moves through a crowded room, quickly enough that nobody had space to stop and question the direction. He would present a number, pause just long enough to let it settle, then move on before anyone could form a full thought about it. It worked because of what it created in the people around him, not agreement exactly, more like the feeling that disagreement would require more energy than most people had available on a Tuesday morning. So they nodded, wrote things down, carried the momentum forward because stopping it felt somehow impolite. That's usually how pressure works in rooms like that. It doesn't force people into anything. It just makes standing still feel harder than moving along. Carol had sat in 43 of these meetings. She had counted. She sat in the same chair each time, third from the left, one seat back from the main table, close enough to observe, far enough that Martin's eyes moved past her naturally when he was scanning for reaction. She had learned over time that Martin needed reaction the way a fire needs oxygen, a nod from the right person, a follow-up question that let him expand on something he had already decided, someone laughing at the right moment. Without it, something in his delivery shifted, barely noticeable, but there. His sentences got slightly longer. His hands moved a little more. He found reasons to return to points he had already made, as if repetition could substitute for the confirmation he hadn't yet received. People reveal themselves in small ways. What happened next was not dramatic. Carol simply stopped providing what he was looking for. No confrontation, no visible change in her expression. She just became still, attentive in a way that gave nothing back. It took 3 meetings before Martin started glancing at her more than he used to. Not because she had done anything. Because she had stopped doing the small, invisible thing that rooms like his depend on. And he couldn't quite identify what was missing. That was the part that would cost him later. The Henderson report had been sitting on desks across the building for 2 weeks before anyone said anything about it publicly. At that time, Carol had said nothing. Not in the Tuesday meeting where Martin walked through the highlights with his usual confidence. Not in the hallway conversation she overheard between 2 senior analysts who agreed, without much examination, that the numbers looked solid. Not when her own manager stopped by her desk, reports in hand, and said the quarter had come in better than expected. She nodded at that, smiled slightly, and returned to what she was doing. That's the thing about silence that most people misread. They assume it means comfort, agreement, the absence of concern, but sometimes silence is the most deliberate choice in the room, and the person making it is simply not ready to use what they know yet. Carol was not ready. She had read the report 3 times. The first time something snagged, not a number exactly, more like a feeling, the way a sentence reads smoothly but lands wrong. She had set it down and gone back to it the next morning. The second time she found page 7. Client attrition. The figure was lower than the raw data supported, not dramatically. That was the careful part. Whoever had changed it understood that dramatic changes get caught. Small ones settle into the document quietly, like a word slightly misspelled, visible only to the person looking for it. She had pulled the original data at 6:43 on a Tuesday, the building still gray and empty around her. Checked the figure, checked it again. Closed the report. Put it in her folder. And went about her day. For 2 weeks she watched the report move through the building. Watch people read it and accept it and build decisions on top of it, the way you build on ground you have never thought to test. Nobody questioned it. That was not surprising. People rarely question documents that tell them what they were hoping to hear. What happened inside Carol during those 2 weeks was not anger, not urgency. It was something quieter and more patient than either of those things. She was waiting for the right room. She had almost found it. The conference room was already full when Carol pushed open the door. That was the point. She had stood in the hallway for 90 seconds, folder in hand, watching the second hand on her watch, and waited until she could hear the sound of a room that had settled. Chairs stopped shifting, conversations dropping to murmurs, Martin's voice beginning to fill the space the way it always did when he felt the room was his. Then she walked in. 3 minutes late is not dramatically late. It is just late enough for everyone to notice without it becoming the subject of the meeting, late enough for heads to turn, late enough for Martin to feel the small disruption and respond to it the way he always responded to disruptions, by shrinking them publicly before they could grow. "Good of you to finally join us, Carol." He said it lightly, almost warmly. The smile was already there before the words finished. A few people smiled along with him, not unkindly, just reflexively. The way people in rooms respond to the person who controls the atmosphere, matching the tone before they have decided whether it is deserved. That's how it works. Public corrections don't need to be cruel to be effective. They just need an audience and a moment of uncertainty in the person receiving them. Most people, when they are made small in front of others, spend the next few minutes recovering instead of thinking. Carol set her folder on the table, sat down, and looked at Martin with an expression that gave him absolutely nothing to work with. No embarrassment, no rushed apology, no small laugh to signal she understood her place in the exchange. Just attention, quiet and direct and completely unrushed. Something shifted in the room so slightly that most people would not have been able to name it, but it was there. The smile on Martin's face held a half-second longer than natural before he turned back to the agenda. He moved on quickly. That was the tell. People who are certain don't hurry past moments. They let them breathe. It's the ones who feel something unexpected that accelerate, filling the space before anyone can examine it too closely. Martin began talking about Q4. Carol opened her folder to the first page, and the room had no idea what was already inside it. 7 words. That was all it took. Not an accusation, not a speech, not the kind of confrontation that announces itself with raised voices and pointed fingers, just a question placed into the middle of a room that had been moving confidently in one direction. "When did you change the numbers on the Henderson report?" The room didn't erupt. That is the part most people would get wrong if they tried to describe it later. There was no dramatic pause, no collective intake of breath. The fluorescent lights kept humming. Someone's phone buzzed quietly on the table and nobody looked at it. The stillness was different from silence. Silence is just the absence of sound. This was something else, the particular quality of air in a room where everyone has suddenly stopped performing and started thinking. Martin smiled. It was a good smile, practiced without being obvious. The smile of a man who has talked his way through difficult rooms before and learned that confidence presented early enough can reshape what a question means before anyone has time to decide for themselves. "I'm not sure what you mean." 5 words that meant, "Give me a moment." 5 words that meant, "I need to understand the size of this before I respond to it." Carol turned one page in her folder. She didn't look up while she did it, didn't scan the room for reaction or support. She moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had already lived through this moment many times in private and was now simply completing it in public. Page 7, Client Attrition. The figure is different from the raw data in the shared drive. I pulled both this morning. She slid 2 pages across the table. And that was when the room changed. Not because of what Carol said, because of what happened in the 3 seconds after she said it. Hands reached for the pages. Eyes dropped to the numbers. People who had nodded along with the Henderson report for 2 weeks were now looking at it again, this time with a different question forming behind their eyes. The moment someone introduces a second version of the truth, the first version stops being safe. Martin's smile was still there, but something behind it had gone very quiet. And everyone in that room felt it before anyone said another word. Martin started talking before the pages had finished moving across the table. That was the first sign. A person with a clean answer waits. They let the question fully land. They give the room a moment to settle before they speak into it. Martin did not wait. He started talking the way someone starts moving when they feel the ground shift beneath them, not toward anything in particular, just away from where they were standing. He mentioned context first. The quarter had been difficult. Certain figures required interpretation. Numbers without context could be misleading, and context was something that took time to explain properly. He said the word context 3 times in the first 90 seconds without seeming to notice. The room listened, but the quality of the listening had changed. Before Carol's question, people had been listening the way they always listened to Martin, receptively, passively, willing to be carried wherever the presentation was going. Now they were listening differently, carefully. The way you listen when you are no longer sure what you are being told and have started separating what is actually being said from how it is being said. Those are very different things. He moved to pressure next. The regional targets had been aggressive. Leadership expected certain numbers, and the team had worked hard to deliver a picture that reflected the effort, not just the outcome. He paused there, as if the sentence had landed the way he intended. It hadn't. Someone across the table set down the 2 pages Carol had distributed and folded their hands quietly on top of them. Said nothing, just stopped moving. Then another person did the same. Small gestures, individually meaningless, but rooms are made of small gestures, and when enough of them shift in the same direction at the same moment, the atmosphere of a room changes whether anyone announces it or not. Martin used the word perspective 3 times. He referenced the team twice. He did not once answer the question Carol had asked. And that was the part nobody needed to say out loud because everyone in the room had already noticed it. The longer he spoke, the more certain they became, not about what he had done, about what he was doing right now. Over-explaining is its own kind of confession. Most people just don't realize they're making it. The meeting ended without resolution. Martin called it a wrap at 10:40, 7 minutes earlier than usual, with the brisk efficiency of a man who needed the room to stop before it could settle into anything permanent. People gathered their things. Chairs pushed back. The dial-in line clicked off in small, quiet successions. Carol closed her folder and took her time. She was still capping her pen when the first person appeared at her elbow. Dennis from Regional Analytics, 12 years in the building, 2 more than Martin. He didn't sit down, didn't make eye contact with anyone passing the glass wall behind them. He just leaned slightly toward her and said quietly, "This isn't the first time." Then he walked out. That was all. No elaboration, no invitation to continue the conversation. Just those 5 words, delivered with the particular economy of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had finally found a place to set down part of it. Carol stayed at the table a little longer. Near the elevator, 20 minutes later, a woman named Grace stopped beside her while they waited. Grace had been in the meeting by phone. Carol hadn't seen her face in the room, only heard her silent presence on the line. She said almost the same thing Dennis had said, in almost the same tone. It happened with the Meridian numbers too, last year. Then the elevator arrived, and Grace stepped in and the doors closed. This is how patterns survive for as long as they do, not because people don't notice, but because noticing alone feels insufficient. One person with an observation is easy to dismiss by others and by themselves. So they carry it quietly, each one assuming they are the only one, each one waiting for a moment that feels sturdy enough to speak into. Carol's question in that meeting had created that moment. By 3 in the afternoon, a third person had stopped by her desk. He didn't say anything. He set down 2 pages, face down, and left without explanation. Carol turned them over. Meridian projections, dated 14 months ago. She added them to the folder without reading them fully. She didn't need to yet. She already understood what they represented. She wasn't the first person to notice Martin. She was just the first one he hadn't accounted for. At 4:15, Carol looked up from her desk and saw Martin crossing the parking lot below. He was moving at a normal pace, briefcase in his right hand, jacket on despite the mild afternoon. To anyone watching without context, he would have looked like any other person leaving work slightly early on a difficult day. But his head was down. That was the detail. Martin never walked with his head down. In 12 years, Carol had watched him move through that building, through lobbies, corridors, parking lots, with the particular uprightness of a man who understood that how you carry yourself is a message. He had always understood that. Today he had forgotten it. She watched him reach his car, watched him pause at the door for a moment longer than necessary, not checking his phone, not looking for keys, just standing there, one hand on the roof of the car, looking at nothing in particular. That's the moment realization actually arrives for most people, not in the room where everything happens, afterward, in the parking lot, in the elevator on the way down, in the small, quiet spaces where the performance finally stops and the actual weight of a thing makes itself known. Carol turned away from the window before he got in the car. She had known, in some quiet way, how this day would move, not because she had designed every moment of it, but because she had been paying attention to the right things for long enough that the shape of it had become visible to her long before it was visible to anyone else. Martin had spent 12 years managing how the building saw him. Carol had spent 7 years watching what he actually did. Those are not the same project, and they do not produce the same results. She picked up the folder from her desk, heavier now than it had been that morning, 3 additional pages inside it that she had not put there herself. She had not won anything today. That was not how she thought about it. She had simply stopped being invisible at the exact moment it mattered most. And Martin, somewhere on the interstate by now, was only just beginning to understand the difference between a room that follows you and a room that has simply been waiting for a reason not to. The following Tuesday came and went without drama. Martin was in his office at 9. He ran his meeting at 9:30. He used the same confident delivery, the same practiced momentum. To someone walking past the glass wall, it would have looked identical to every other Tuesday for the past 12 years. But the room was different. Not loudly, not visibly, just different in the way a house feels different after someone has decided to leave it. Everything still in its place, nothing yet removed, but the atmosphere already changed by a decision that hasn't been announced. 2 people who always sat close to Martin had chosen seats further down the table. Nobody commented on it. Nobody needed to. Control rarely disappears all at once. It loosens first, in small practical ways that don't make the news but accumulate into something that can't be reversed. By Wednesday afternoon, words had moved through the building the way words move in buildings, not through announcements, but through the particular quality of silence that surrounds certain names when they come up in conversation. The slight pause, the redirected eye contact, the topic that gets changed is just a beat too quickly. Martin's name had developed that quality. Thursday, Carol received an email from someone 2 levels above Martin. It was brief, professional. It asked if she would be available for a conversation the following week. It did not explain why. She replied within the hour. By Friday, Martin was in a meeting she had not been invited to and had not been told about. She learned about it the same way she had learned most things in that building, by paying attention to what was absent rather than what was present. His assistant's expression when Carol passed her desk. The conference room was booked under an unfamiliar name. The way certain people avoided the second floor between 2 and 4. That's usually how it works. The conversations that matter most in a building are the ones that don't appear on the shared calendar. Carol ate lunch at her desk that Friday. Finished the Meridian pages she had set aside earlier in the week. Added 3 careful lines to the dark blue notebook. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. She felt the particular stillness of someone who had waited a long time for something to become visible to others that had always been visible to her. Carol kept the notebook. Not as a record, not as evidence. She kept it the way you keep something that taught you the value of patience at a moment when patience was the hardest thing to maintain. She was asked, months later, by a younger colleague how she had known when to speak. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't wait until I was angry. I waited until I was certain." The colleague nodded slowly, wrote something down. Carol watched her and said nothing more. Some things are better discovered than explained. Sometimes people don't lose control all at once. Sometimes they lose it one small assumption at a time. One misread person, one unexamined number, one moment of public carelessness aimed at someone who had been quietly preparing for a very long time. Martin walked into that room believing he understood everyone in it. He had understood everyone except the one person who had decided, long ago, that being understood was not what she was there for. One question, 7 words, and a room full of people who finally stopped and looked in the right direction. If stories like this stay with you, quiet, human, and built around the way people really behave when no one is watching, Alfred, beyond the story was made for you. New stories every week. Subscribe so you never miss one.